YouTube. Thanks, Mark. I will now be transferring the floor to our moderator, Ms. Sandra, for the proceedings of our discussions today. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Christian. And good afternoon and good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. My name is Sandra Ebalration and I'm with Franciscans International. It is my privilege to welcome you all on this event, acknowledging the presence of members of the diplomatic community with us today. Some from embassies in Manila and also representative of permanent missions in Geneva. So welcome to everyone and to this event titled Rise Against Reprisals, the situation of human rights defenders in the Philippines. To speak to this situation of human rights defenders in the Philippines, we have the privilege to have an excellent panel today with us. I think who could not be more legitimate to speak to this reality. And I will introduce them, all of them, or each of them as they will take the floor. So I'm not doing that now, but want to acknowledge and welcome them. Yes, this event is, as usual, very timely for various reasons. And I will be short in my introduction to give the most time to our panelists, but I just would like to flag a couple of these reasons. Obviously, this session of the Human Rights Council that is happening now is a session in which we will have the UN Secretary General report on reprisals and also a draft resolution on cooperation with the UN that aims to strengthen the responses by the UN and states to acts of intimidation and reprisals against those who engage with the UN system. So it is an opportunity to speak again internationally in the situation of human rights defenders, including those who engage with the system. But it is also a session in which it is really an opportunity to look again at the situation in the Philippines that is extremely preoccupying to many of us NGOs. And the panel today will say why this is so preoccupying, including and especially for the situation and the safety of human rights defenders in the country. But I also would like to recall that this session is the session where we will really have the opportunity to look at human rights defenders, the shrinking civil space in the Philippines, as we are looking at the efficiency or inefficiency of the current response of the system to the situation in the Philippines, with, among others, the overall update of the High Commissioner, Mrs. Bachelet. And again, our panel today will speak to this issues at stake at this session of the Council. So without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker, Mr. Eliezer Carlos, who is the Secretary General of Philippines Alliance of Human Rights Advocates. Mr. Carlos will speak to the situation in the Philippines, giving us an overview, a general overview of the situation, including political situation that allows what is happening or give the general context for what is happening to human rights defenders and civil society. So Eliezer, you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Sandra, for the kind introduction. A pleasant day to everyone. Greetings of human rights solidarity to all who are here. I'd like to mention especially the special thanks to the representatives of the Human Rights Council member states, capitals, Geneva missions, as well as the representatives of embassies here in Manila for giving their time, precious time to hear us out, hear the situation in the Philippines, and particularly focused on the situation of human rights defenders. Essentially, I'd also like to thank our international partner organizations who are here. Ms. Sandra already mentioned it, that the relevance of our side event is really, it coincides with the ongoing Human Rights Council session, no, 48th session, and it's this 48th session is special because the High Commissioner will also provide an oral update on October 7th on the implementation of the Joint Human Rights Program, which was given birth to by October 2020 Resolution 45/33. But there was a previous resolution, June 2019, by the Human Rights Council that had an original intention, which was really to seek for a step towards establishing an investigative body, such as a commission of inquiry or fact-finding mission that would take a look into the situation in the Philippines. But basically, what I'm here to do, although our focus is the situation of human rights defenders and shrinking civic space, I'm here to provide an overview and analysis of the political crisis that coincides with the human rights crisis that enables the human rights crisis here in the Philippines. Now, what we had in 2016, and this is 30 years after the EDSA revolution, in 1986, was that a particular candidate, Rodrigo Roa Duterte, efficiently exploited the Filipinos' frustration and despair. The promise of representative democracy, more responsive to the people, was never really realized after EDSA. So essential services and opportunities were never democratized, and the nation's wealth was never equitably distributed or redistributed, and radical social reforms that revolution promised never took place. So a lot of Filipinos were really frustrated by that, but also disillusioned by the inoperable and anti-poor criminal justice system. And so a lot of us subscribed to the replication, the proposal of Duterte to replicate what he did in Davao, no? The progress and orderliness, and the shortcuts that were undertaken, legal shortcuts resulting in extrajudicial killings in Davao, should be replicated nationwide. And now, since 2016, we see a multifold human rights calamity. You have massive extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances and torture, and the relentless pursuit of the war on drugs, even amidst the health crisis, continues. Basically, Duterte has three wars that make for the state of war in the Philippines, or state of belligerency. You have the war on drugs, essentially a sham war that is a war on the poor. The war on terror, which is a war on human rights defenders, legitimate dissent, and civic space. And this multifold human rights crisis also coincides with the severe erosion of a human rights culture, exploited the fact that the vast majority of Filipinos, human rights were abstract concepts. So there's that extreme distortion of human rights ideals, values, and principles. He has publicly threatened human rights defenders, publicly denigrated us, defining human rights defenders as obstacles to development, as obstructionists to justice and coddlers of criminals, and sowing public discontent against us. Therefore, this has drastically constricted space for human rights discourse and defense, rolled back all human rights and democratic gains in the past 30 years in 2016, and now 35 years. So nearly all meaningful discourse on human rights has stopped. And we're faced also with a social, cultural, and moral crisis, including a culture of misogyny. Our concern now is really the intergenerational social damage, or the critical impact on the next generations of Filipinos. No? So with the war on drugs, for us, we have seen the establishment of a permission structure for mass murder. It promoted the myth that the crisis in the country can be solved by exterminating addicts, small-time peddlers, and not the eradication of the roots of poverty that creates drug dependence and various forms of criminal acts. No, this is a crisis created to shift the focus of the people away from the real problems of inequality and poverty, and is really a populist and repression tool. No? So no genuine intentions whatsoever to resolve the drug issue. As publicly dehumanized drug dependents and drug peddlers, and therefore has established public acceptance of, through sustained incitement to hate and violence, public acceptance, no, to pursue relentlessly the drug war. So there's that erosion of the universality of the right to life through the normalized drug-related killings. I must mention that there's a huge underdocumentation of these cases due to the health crisis as well as the assault on human rights defenders. Now, the other war, the war on terror, which is a war on human rights, essentially, there's that constant virulence of anti-human rights rhetoric that has seeped down to the general population. The mischaracterizing of human rights defenders as enemies of the state again, his disdain for critics and members of social movements, the terrorist tagging of human rights defenders in change-oriented groups, and attacking the legitimate opposition as a whole. You have the militarization of rural communities, and the rights to peaceably assemble and the freedom of expression have been severely compromised. Our work as sentinels of democracy and society have been severely compromised as well. So with respect to the other war, which is the war on COVID, it's nothing more than a dole-out and militarist approach in addressing the health crisis. Still, the use of state violence, kill policies, the order to shoot to kill those violating community quarantine rules, and again, uniformed forces playing a leading key role in the implementation of these protocols. No? And the treatment of people as herds or as passive, powerless recipients and beneficiaries of dole-outs. So I'd like to focus on impunity and institutionalizing impunity and making human life cheap in the Philippines. He has provided the police and actually ordered the police to have a wide latitude to kill and programming them to be quick on the trigger, further altered the mindset of an already predisposed to violence policing sector, promising them a protection from litigation, forced quotas for police precincts, and has brought a death squad epidemic nationwide. No? There's a clear link between the police and these vigilante killings. And also the co-optation of village governance units, the barangays, the smallest governance units in the Philippines, in the war on drugs and the war on human rights defenders. So by putting in place this de facto kill society's undesired state policy, Duterte is directly responsible for at least 30,000 state-perpetrated killings in the context of the war on drugs, as well as many killings of human rights activists and agents of change and sentinels of democracy. So it's the meltdown really of democratic institutions and the routine disregard for the rule of law and circumvention of due process, and systematically dismantling democratic guarantees and rendering domestic accountability mechanisms ineffective in the Philippines. So there's just one bottom line for this administration and Duterte, is really the preoccupation to build the state apparatus for dictatorship, to consolidate and advance an authoritarian agenda, weaponizing the war on drugs, the war on terror, or the war on human rights, and co-opting and making subservient the entire legislature and our Supreme Court, rendering ineffective fragile Philippine institutions and the social programming, actually, as in Bolsonaro style Brazil, manipulating and shaping public opinion and capturing public support and active consensus through a well-oiled and financed propaganda machinery, and weaponizing and bending the law as well. And then you have attacks on critics and sectors which have traditionally defended democracy, media outfits, the Commission on Human Rights, the church, and others who have raised concerns such as the UN High Commissioner, and as well as special rapporteurs, who have focused their attention on the Philippines. So violence is really the defining character of this administration. And paradigm for change is solely rested on these violence, peace and order, and anti-dissent frameworks. This he reaffirmed to relentlessly pursue these death programs during his 6th and last State of the Nation address last July. I'd like to focus on lawfare, or the weaponization of law, which is at the center stage of the war on human rights defenders. He uses these policies, laws, and as tools to normalize state violence, sow fear among the populace, intimidate and silence critics of the state, criminalize dissent and opposition by framing civic participation as a destabilizing force, shrinking democratic space, legalizing repression and authoritarian rule, and rejecting and abandoning transparency and accountability. Now, focusing now on the Joint Human Rights Program. This is a big contradiction for us. The entire human rights community, human rights movement, as well as the entire movement for change in the Philippines. It's a big contradiction. Our question is, in a climate wherein the key ingredients for securing absolute rule have been purposefully being established, is there serious government intent, space, and any trust and confidence between the stakeholders for the Joint Human Rights Framework or Program implementation? The direction this administration is heading, having had reaffirmed that the war on drugs and the war on terror will continue to be relentlessly pursued, we have serious doubts whether the contentious deliverables under the Joint Human Rights Program will be seriously taken by this government. The Joint Human Rights Program also does not meet the human rights calamity head-on. It does not deal with the massive human rights violations directly and with determination. The root cause of these massive human rights violations, are the President's explicit orders to the security forces here in the Philippines. The Joint Human Rights Program has a framework that addresses long-term behavioral and change and institutional reforms, which is quite different from the root cause itself. Now, recommendations for us to the capitals, Geneva missions, as well as the Manila diplomatic community members and the Human Rights Council as a whole, is to continue to monitor the situation in the Philippines and to raise concern at the Council through various means consistently, such as statements by member states, insist in the human rights safeguard provided by the Joint Human Rights Program to be spurred into action when it becomes evident, not after 3 years, that the government of the Republic of the Philippines is unable and unwilling to really work on the contentious issues under the Joint Human Rights Program. That's important that we quickly sound the alarm if we see that the Duterte administration isn't serious. Help in the growth of support for a council resolution that establishes an independent international body that will conduct an impartial and transparent investigation into the massive human rights violations in the Philippines. Now, just a few important points on the nexus between the ICC and the Human Rights Council. We all know the good progress that the good news that was the good progress that was yielded through the process of the ICC preliminary examination. So the fact that the situational analysis section, as well as the victims' participation and reparation section, did their 3 years work in terms of evaluating merit for an investigation in the Philippines, definitely reveals that the grave situation in the country. So instead of dissipating responsibility, since there's already a mechanism that is responding to the Philippines, it should actually make the council members more responsible in terms of responding to the Philippines. First, the ICC only has jurisdiction up to March 17, 2019. That only covers the extrajudicial killings victims of the drug war, not the victims after that date, but also not all the victims of extrajudicial killings and other grave human rights violations on activists and human rights defenders. Now, this is the Commission of Inquiry as well as the fact-finding mission by the Human Rights Council. If this comes out with its report in the future, this will be important for the Philippines because we would like, when democratic space becomes wider, to establish a truth commission, a domestic process. Nothing replaces domestic mechanisms to really establish the truth on what has happened in the Philippines so that this will never be repeated again. This has happened to us twice already, during the Marcos regime and during the Duterte regime. And then also, important to note that this administration has no coherent social justice agenda or policy that would effectively address widespread abject poverty and stem the rising unemployment. So definitely, more rights defenders will pursue change-oriented work in such a context, and given the routine and standard state response, violence, human rights violations will continue to persist. And then lastly, it's difficult for us politically. I mentioned the political crisis already. Given what the state apparatus and impunity infrastructure that has been established, as well as the political conditions, most likely, given this situation, in the upcoming 2022 election year, the one that will inherit the president's seat will be another Duterte likeness, either his daughter or another one who is populist as well as gung-ho and anti-human rights. So most likely Dutertismo and this administration's repressive infrastructure will continue if we do not work hand in hand to address the political crisis that enables the gravest of human rights violations to persist. So we would like to request the support, active support through the active to help in terms of calling for and taking action on direct accountability action on the part of the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Budit, for this, and especially for the call that we just heard, and I think it was really well heard. And thank you also for providing, as I announced, this broader overview of the situation that allows the attacks on human rights defenders, and especially the narrative and the culture that is entertained by the government of contempt for human rights defenders and for the work within society, and also for this context of violence and hatred that is really pervasive in society, and that shows the inadequacy of the international response at the moment, especially in the light, as you recalled very, very rightly, in the light of the progress made by ICC that should be really the indication of the seriousness and the gravity of the situation that that requires another kind of action by the Human Rights Council. And also to highlight again the different wars led by the Duterte's regime. And with that, I would like to pass the floor to the second of our panelists, Father Christian Buenafe, who is the chairperson of the Task Force Detainees of the Philippines. Father Christian will speak to one of this war in particular, the war on terror, and the shrinking civic space, with giving us some trends, patterns, and also, I think, some emblematic cases. So Father Christian, you have 10, 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sandra. To all the members of the diplomatic community, the friends, our friends from the various human rights groups and international solidarity groups, the participants of the UNHRC Session 48 who are present here, our friends from Geneva and here in Manila, fellow human rights defenders, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I greet you all, Pax et Bonum. It is a famous Franciscan greeting. It means peace and all good, as today the Catholic Church celebrates this man of peace by the name of Saint Francis of Assisi. But I am not just optimistic, but really hopeful that peace and goodness will once again reign in our land, the Philippines. Allow me to share some facts about the ongoing war on terror in our country that affects directly the human rights community and the human rights defenders and the Filipino people in general. We are in the last leg of the Duterte administration. From today to May 9, 2022, we barely have 7 months and 5 days to go before the national elections next year. It is good to note and ask, where are the human rights defenders now in the shrinking democratic space where human rights violations rise unabated? The human rights community in the Philippines is under attack, as the government has openly labeled and tagged the various human rights groups as anti-government, troublemaker, and pro-communist since the Duterte government took power in July 2016. Human rights defenders are being attacked as they are targets of threats, harassments, tortures, arrests, and deaths. Attacks and threats of the state are directed to progressive individuals and organizations, critics, especially those who condemn its anti-poor, anti-human rights policies, programs, and plans. Allow me to enumerate some of our experiences from the grounds and even here in the open human rights work, what we experience and we suffer a lot. First, threats, intimidation, and harassments. A number of HRDs have been receiving calls from unknown numbers through SMS messages, through text from unknown number, threatening them about, we know who you are, what you do, where do you live? The color of your gate is green and your son or daughter is like this and like that. And telling them to stop your work of documenting human rights violations or else you will be shot. And we have experienced this from our TFDP workers when they went to Negros, to document. And this is not happening. This is happening not only to TFDP, but in most human rights defenders. To most human rights defenders. Religious leaders, the bishops, the priests from the Protestant and the Catholic Christian churches, religious sisters are bullied and threatened openly. Physical surveillance. Some of our offices and religious houses are being monitored as suspicious people with cars are parked outside our offices, and they take pictures of those who enter and exit the premises. These agents ask the neighboring stores about the people who reside in that house or who enter in that office. And these groups had even forcibly blocked one of our staff on his way home by 2 cars, and then an unidentified men asked him or presented to him some pictures of his wife, his daughter, and we know where are you were living, etc. And trying to force him to admit that he is a supporter of the anti-government thing. So they insisted that he belongs to these groups. No? So this is one example on how they harass our human rights defenders. Activity monitoring and raids. No? So especially the case of Lumads, or the Lumads are the indigenous peoples, 42 Lumad students and 5 Lumad teachers, together with 3 tribal leaders, the Datus or the indigenous peoples leaders at the University of San Carlos compound in February 15, on February 15 this year. And they were there to rescue, but in fact, people know that they are there to finish a certain curriculum, and that was with the permission of the parents. All of a sudden, police people came, and then they rescued, apparently rescued, but they were there because of some reasons. It was pandemic, and they are locked there, etc., etc. The second is red tagging and terrorist tagging of legitimate human rights organizations, community media groups, church-run organizations and mission partners, and individuals who are vocal and loud in criticizing the government's policy on kill, kill, kill. Red tagging, disinformation, and misinformation campaigns against individuals, groups, and organizations are labeled as enemies of the state, terrorists, or even drug dealers. PAHRA and other member organizations of the alliance were not exempted by it. The implementation of the government's Executive Order number 70, series of 2018, institutionalizing the whole of nation approach in attaining inclusive and sustainable peace, creating the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or ELCAC, and directing the adoption of the National Peace Framework, comprehensive issuances that directs all agencies to make their own guidelines and protocols. The president is the chair, and the National Security Agency advisor as vice chair. This is the tool in their conspiracy tagging with other legitimate groups and programs working in the grassroots, like the Lumad schools, the Save Our Schools, the rural missionaries, partnering with other peasant groups, and of course, human rights groups. That as if Alistair mentioned about the demonization of human rights, that if you use the term human rights, you are anti-Duterte. The third, cyber surveillance and cyber attack. And just recently, yesterday, the Army had countered the accusation that one of the Army's internet protocol, or IP, addresses was behind the cyber attacks on the alternative news website bulatlat.com. This is not in the mainstream, but alternative community-based media practitioners had, but the military claimed that they were just simply browsing or surfing. Fourth, funding, monitoring, control, and regulatory pressures. There is an increased pressure on foreign donors to scrutinize funding support extended to Philippine NGOs critical of the government. And that was the experience of Rural Missionaries of the Philippines and Karapatan. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC Memorandum Circular number 15, in 2018, mandated NGOs to submit additional requirement for registration or renewal of registration. Memorandum Circular 15 requires a mandatory disclosure of sources, amount, and application of funds, programs, and activities planned, ongoing and accomplished, beneficiaries, and locations of operations. That's why that was also the instruction of the Department of Foreign Affairs to foreign embassies that all foreign government funding intended for Philippine NGO, regardless of mode of disbursement, transfer of download of funds, shall be coursed through the DFA of the Philippines for appropriate clearance. The communication was released on February 5, 2021 as Note 2, 2021-0592. But there was no signatory on that, but only a stamp from the DFA. Of course, we challenged this in the court. I hope we have some updates, no positive updates. Number 5, trump up legal cases, criminalization of political actions that lead to arrest and detention. There were cases of arrest and detention. We have TFDP had documented, at the very start of the Anti-Terror Act by PAHRA and TFDP, there were already more than 20 cases of arrest and detention, and extra killings continue. That's why it's difficult to give the number, because every now and then the numbers change. Because we thought it's like this, all of a sudden one is shot tonight or tomorrow again. So they are detained. When we conduct mass actions, they are sometimes barred to attend and question. And of course, the famous Senator Laila de Lima is incarcerated now in its 4th year, and she is denied of due process. 6, enforced disappearances. Desaparecido cases. We have documented 18 cases of disappearances early this year. Mostly are Muslim brothers. We have 18 of them from Taguig, Malate, and Cavite. And of course, killings and assassinations. At least 20 media practitioners were killed, and more than 100 incidents of media attacks during the Duterte regime. More than 60 lawyers killed since 2016, and the latest was last September. Lawyer Juan Macababa, the vice chair of Union of People's Lawyers in Mindanao. Well, since 2016, 3 priests were killed, hundreds of HRDs, indigenous peoples, trade union leaders and organizers, farmers, farmer leaders, peasants were also killed since 2016. Of course, they are not HRDs, the political opponents, maybe the court judges and prosecutors were also killed. And the Global Witness 2020, for this year, they had recorded 43 environment and land rights conflict HRDs killed. From 2016 to 2019, at least 113. There were women human rights defenders killed, around 17 from 2016 to 17 in a year's time. And there's also proliferation of national laws which restrict and criminalize human rights defenders' work. So killings are happening by the day, whether it's a war against drugs or war against terror. So that's why from the Task Force Days of the Philippines, with PAHRA, we call on a follow-up on the Iceland resolution and really push the government to open itself for accountability, and therefore an international commission on inquiry or a fact-finding mission must be conducted. So we call on the government to end the assault to human rights defenders and the killings of HRDs. We oppose the anti-terror law of 2020 and other repressive laws. We support the enactment of the Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill that is filed in our Congress, and we respect and protect the human rights defenders. Peace and all good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Father Christian. And in fact, on this day of St. Francis feast, I just can wish you a lot of peace in the Philippines. And it's always very frustrating and sad for me to be part of events with friends and colleagues in the Philippines, because obviously the situation is not really evolving to the better. And I've been doing that for some years now. So I just can't help saying that on my end. But with that, I really would like also to thank you for giving some more specific information about the situation of human rights defenders. And as you said, progressive individuals, generally speaking, and organization criticizing anti-poor policies, really generally speaking again. And thank you also for describing for us the concrete forms that this repression, this harassment and attacks take for human rights defenders in their daily life and daily work, including red tagging and accusation of being terrorists, obviously, and criminalization. And notably under the Anti-Terror Act 2020 that you just mentioned, and that allows me to go to our third speaker today, Attorney Gilbert Andres, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Center for International Law Philippines. Attorney Gilbert will tell us what makes the Anti-Terror Act 2020 so dangerous for human rights defenders, and it will be really a state of the art on this act, which I understand is being challenged in court anyway. But that's exactly what we would like to hear from you, Mr. Gilbert Andres. And also, I just would like, before giving you the floor, to recall that participants are really welcome to post comments and questions in the chat already. I will try to monitor them. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session. Attorney Gilbert, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sandra, and greetings to the members of the foreign missions and to the members of the international community. I'm tasked to do an update on the anti-terrorism law. And let me just give a quick context on the Anti-Terrorism Act, or the ATA. It was signed into law last year, July 3, 2020, by President Rodrigo Duterte, and it took effect on July 21, 2020. Now, 37 petitions were actually filed against the ATA before the Philippine Supreme Court, challenging its constitutionality. And just a disclosure, I'm actually one of the petitioner and as well as a counsel in the 27th petition. Now, oral arguments were actually conducted before the Philippine Supreme Court from February of this year until May of this year. And there were about nine days of oral arguments. And just last June 25, 2021, the 37 petitioner groups, as well as the respondent public officers, simultaneously filed their respective memoranda on the Anti-Terrorism Act. Now, let me be very clear. The Supreme Court has not issued any injunctive relief against the Anti-Terrorism Act. Secondly, the Anti-Terrorism Act is still in effect. Third, the constitutional challenge is under resolution by the Philippine Supreme Court. In fact, in a chance interview by reporters to the Philippine Chief Justice, he said, and I will quote, "Hopefully within the year, perhaps we can have a decision on 37 petitions before the year ends." So technically, the constitutional challenges are still under resolution by the Philippine Supreme Court. Now, let me go on to how the ATA is being applied on the ground. In fact, August of last year, 2 ATAs, which is an indigenous peoples group, were actually arrested by the armed forces of the Philippines and charged under the ATA for allegedly being members of the New People's Army. Just last July 15 of this year, the Regional Trial Court in Olongapo City dismissed the charges based on mistaken identity. Ironically, just days after that dismissal, 4 farmers were arrested, again by the armed forces of the Philippines, and they were charged under the ATA for allegedly helping members of the New People's Army. But the greatest irony here is that it's really the minority groups that are most vulnerable under the Anti-Terrorism Act. In fact, there were also warnings by public officers with respect to the use of the Anti-Terrorism Act as against dissent directed against the Duterte administration. Now, let me go to the final part of my talk, which is the normative consequences. Ethically, I'm actually limited in discussing the pros and cons of the constitutional challenge against the ATA. But let me just discuss on its face, what are the provisions of the ATA? In fact, I invite you to look at 3 of the provisions. It's in Section 3H, as well as Section 10, and Section 25, and Section 36. Now, why am I inviting you to look at these sections? Because these 4 sections actually invoke the UN Security Council Resolution 1373, passed last September of 2001 in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And these provisions of the ATA, Section 3, Section 10, Section 25, and Section 36, actually also refer to the UN Security Council list of designated persons, organizations, associations, and groups as allegedly terrorist groups. Now, why am I pointing this out? Because in fact, it's so ironic that the Duterte administration, early on in its term, actually derided the UN human rights system. And yet, it is now invoking the UN Security Council resolution and the designated list to actually be an excuse or its justification for the Anti-Terrorism Act, which leads me to my call for the international community and specifically for the UN Human Rights Council. It's important for the UN Human Rights Council to be active in this norm-creating process of international law, specifically by protecting human rights for all UN member states. And how can the UN Human Rights Council and the international community be an active participant in that norm-creative role? Well, I call on the UN Human Rights Council and the international community to undertake and pass a resolution that will direct the Philippines to have direct accountability as to its compliance with international human rights instruments such as the UDHR, the ICCPR, and the Convention Against Torture. Secondly, I call on the UN Human Rights Council and the international community to encourage the UN member states to draft a convention for the protection of human rights defenders in line with the 75th anniversary of the UDHR this coming December 2023. The call for security must be balanced with respect for international human rights law as well as international humanitarian law due to the asymmetry between the state and civil society. The state has all the forces in its disposal to actually adequately address terrorist acts. But civil society only has its power of truth-telling to contend with. Hence, I also call the UN Human Rights Council to take on that active role in calling for the Philippines to pass the bill on the protection of human rights defenders, which is still pending in the Philippine Congress. With that, I thank you all. Good day.
Thank you very, very much, Attorney Gilbert, for these calls as well that I think were very well heard, and also for explaining to us a bit more the issues at stake with the ATA and the several constitutionality challenges that are currently before the Supreme Court. And yes, we understood that we are waiting for the resolution and we don't really know when it will happen, and that in the meantime, this act is in force, is in effect, and is having very concrete and tangible implications and consequences for people on the ground, including through the cases, the examples that you gave of minorities and dissenting people, including indigenous people being arrested falsely under this act. And also for the details that you, or the highlights that you gave us without obviously going too far, as I understand you are also involved in the procedure. So thank you so much for this intervention. And with that, I would like to give the floor to our last but not least speaker. And we are very privileged and honored to have Representative Amilda Sangkopan, who is representative of the Anak Mindanao party list, so member of the House of Representatives in the Congress. And we are very happy to have you, Mrs. Sangopan, as you are also part of a group of active legislators, so from the Congress, from the Senate, and from the House of Representatives, legislators for human rights, so the so-called Macatao group. And we are very happy to give you the floor so that you can give us your view on the current situation in the light of what colleagues have been saying on the panel. So I give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sandra. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, international missions, to our esteemed partners and fellow colleagues of the Philippine Alliance on Human Rights Advocates, to my beloved and kapwa Komoro, or Muslims, who are with us today, fellow officials and employees from the government, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. May peace, mercy, and blessings of Allah be upon you all. A pleasant afternoon to everyone. It is inspiring and encouraging to be here with you this afternoon and be among the participants in the observance of the 48th United Nations Human Rights Council. As a side event initiated by PAHRA, entitled Rising Against Reprisals, an online forum on the situation of human rights defenders in the Philippines, it is comforting to know that we have stern and durable partners na tumatayo at lumalaban para sa karapatang pantao ng bawat Pilipino, anuman ang relihiyon, kaugalian, tradisyon at paniniwala. In an ideal world where we are all equals, in an ideal world where it is impossible to be misunderstood, in an ideal world where all of our words are all attuned just for the achievement of our greater future, if only such an ideal world be true to us, Moros or Muslims. But today, in this reality, where we all partake in,
I'm sorry, could colleagues just turn off their microphone when they are not speaking? Because I think it's disturbing the speaker. Or can the administrator, yeah, just muting. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Madam Representative, just go ahead. Thank you.
It's okay. It's okay. But allow me to continue. But today, in this reality where we all partake in, when I speak about human rights, it is as if I am speaking with a blade inside my mouth, painful, bloody, and gut-wrenching. Why? We live in a world where we Muslims are often the target of hate speeches, our religion the subject of defamation, and our human rights and dignities trampled upon often by the very people who were sworn to protect us. For years, we the Muslims in the country are discriminated, intimidated, and subjected to violence. In many parts of the world, there exists the rise of hate speech against Muslim and anti-Muslim prejudices. Often, these hateful words easily lead to physical attacks on our brothers and sisters and set off a cycle of violence. For years after the 9/11 attack, Islamophobia worsened. Muslims have been negatively stereotyped as extremists that has resulted in bias, discrimination, and marginalization. It is a brand that we Muslims, even in this country, we Moros in this country strive to change each day, hoping that someday we shall walk and share this earth with you, our fellow Filipinos, as equals. Sadly, in our country, the legislation that would somehow provide some kind of a counter legislation to the already passed anti-terrorism law, which is the measure that seeks to protect racial discrimination, is still pending in the Senate. Thus, we are probably failing to take appropriate actions to protect our Muslims and Moros against these tirades and attacks. Who would forget the circulation of a memo ordering members of the police force to profile male Muslim high schools and college students in the National Capital Region? This representation reacted to such memorandum and have manifested the same before the House Committee on Human Rights when we were tackling or deliberating upon the passage and approval of the substitute bill that seeks to protect and prohibit discrimination on account of racial or religious affiliation. Another are the miners and a farmer from Maco, Davao del Oro that while eating balot in downtown Tagum were accosted and accused of being taped by soldiers. For days they were beaten and tortured until they were made to dig their own graves. poured crude oil on their bodies, set them on fire before leaving them for dead. Or the slip of the tongue by one governor from the north who said that it is relatively peaceful in his town because there are no Muslims residing there. Such derogatory statement coming from a local chief executive brought so much uproar in our communities. And when we talk of war on terror, where we Muslims are subject, who can forget the Marawi siege that happened in 2017? That incident ran for 5 long months before the city was liberated 4 years ago, almost the same month. Up until today, the rehabilitation of the city have not been concluded. Legislation that seeks to provide compensation to those affected have been, alhamdulillah, passed on third and final reading in the House of Representatives and approved at the committee level in the Senate. And we are still looking forward that the same would eventually pass into law. My friends, fellow advocates of human rights, fellow peacemakers, based on my observation, war on terror affecting us Muslims or Moros in this country is more on discrimination and stereotyping against us on account of our religion, our ethnic origin or affiliation. Many public institutions also lack enough awareness on the subject of our religion in many parts of the archipelago, when it should be expressly, actively, and positively campaigned to the public. Even more distressing is the fact that legitimate business owners and entrepreneurs have become targets of men by evil intent, who do not rob them of their hard-earned fortune, but of the lives of our Muslim brothers and sisters. In the short time since this representation served in the House of Representatives for Anak Mindanao Amin Party List, we have seen and witnessed the spite of killings and atrocities made against us Moros. And it is so disheartening to know that the perpetrators of these crimes were allegedly members of our uniformed personnel. Please allow me to share with you some of these horrific incidences of crimes made against us, Moros or Muslims, na magpasa hanggang ngayon ay hinahanap pa rin natin ang hustisya. On August 2, 2019, at around 9:30 in the morning, police and operatives of the National Bureau of Investigation raided the house of Aljan Mandi in Barangay Candiis, town of Haji Muhammad Ajul in the province of Basilan. This raid resulted in the deaths of Aljan Mandi, Jamsid Mandi, and Rajak Amma. This operation was conducted in the absence of any coordination with the military unit in charge or with the local authorities. On June 12, 2020, Mr. Abdullah Palawan Maute and Saaduddin Alawiya, both Muslims and legitimate jewelry traders from San Andres, Bukid, Manila, were subjected to unreasonable search and seizures and illegal warrantless arrest made by 6 members of the Manila Police District Station 5. That were uniformed personnel went to the house of the victims without properly identifying themselves and without any search or arrest warrants. That the alleged intrusion into the private homes of the victims was without proper and prior coordination with the barangay officials, PIDEA, and even the police station in the area, thus violating the standard operating procedure in conducting search or buy-bust operation. It was also reported that there were anomalies in the said police operation, such as the use of falsely marked vehicles with tampered plate numbers, failure of the police officers to properly identify themselves to the occupant of the house when requested to do so several times, failure to call representatives of the barangay, the media, and DOJ to witness the proper marking of evidence on site, if any, and conduct of prior search before any arrest was made. How gruesome it was. Why? That day, every Filipino was celebrating Independence Day, but we Muslims in the country were in pain, knowing that our fellow Muslims have been subject to illegal searches and arrest. And August 29, 2020, the nation witnessed the killing of 9 Muslim farmers in Cabacan, North Cotabato, which has sparked outrage among Muslim communities after initial investigations revealed that the victims were allegedly executed and not killed in a shootout as reported by authorities. There was even an attempt where the shootout was made between feuding clans, or locally known as Rido, that led to the death of 8 victims killed on the spot, while the other one expired at the local hospital. All of them were farmers who are coming home after partaking in a feast from nearby town. The victims were said to be gunned down after they were waylaid by unidentified gunmen along the road inside the University of Southern Mindanao or USM. Major Peter Pinalgan Jr. of Cabacan Town Police Station Chief said the victims were strafed while standing by the roadside along Aringay Road inside the state-run University of Southern Mindanao campus. In one news article, the dying declaration by one of the victims who expired later in the hospital revealed that it was the policeman who stopped and shot them. All this gruesome incident has led us, along with other fellow legislators, to call for a thorough and independent congressional inquiry into the alleged involvement of PNP personnel in the condemnable savagery made against us, not because we are Muslims, but because we are human who share the equal protection under the law and of the Constitution. All these resolutions were all in aid of legislations. These unlaw and monstrous villainous acts involving our law enforcement agencies are no longer a novelty nor an isolated incident for us Muslims or Moros. But this is not to say that we should grow accustomed to these crimes made against us. Dahil ang masanay at magpalagpas sa mga ganitong uri ng kahayupan sa amin ay para na ding pamimigay ng aming buhay at sa buhay ng aming mga mahal. When we chose to be silent amid the chaos that surrounds us, then we reduce ourselves into nothing of which they treat us as such. If we do not counter hatred through convincing arguments, good actions, and free debate, then we become our worst enemy. Kaming mga Moro, Muslim, ay maraming higit na kailangang gawin at patunayan to show to our countrymen and to the whole world that we are one with them in pursuing peace, that we are against all forms of discrimination, hate speeches, and terrorism. Hindi nga ba ang unang pangunahing biktima o casualty ng terorismo ay kaming mga Muslim mismo? Aren't we the largest group of victims at the hands of Muslim terrorists with our mosques and homes and schools used as private targets of violence? Just look at Marawi. Marawi is still crawling its way back to life of normalcy. Just look at our non-Moro tribes folk in the Bangsamoro region who continue to experience hardships and famine as they scamper away with their lives from the lands of which they own. Naparami pong injustices. Napakarami pong naulilang mga kabataan at kababaihan ng dahil sa dahas at abuse ng power. Kaya nga po, reliving and retelling these horrid tales is for me like chewing a blade, where you can taste the blood of the senseless and violent deaths of my fellow Muslim brethren, my fellow Moro. Thus, when we passed judgment on the Anti-Terrorism Law, which amended the Human Security Act of 2007, Anak Mindanao Amin Party List through this representation was one of the 31 members in the House of Representatives who voted against it. Kaming mga Moro at Lumad ang unang biktima ng tunay na terorismo. Hindi lamang sa bansang ito, kundi sa iba't ibang panig din ng mundo. At sa pagpapatupad ng batas laban umano sa terorismo, naniniwala akong dadagdagan lamang nito ang pagpapahirap at pang-aabuso sa tulad naming nahuhusgahan agad ng mga terorismo bago pa malaman ang aming mga pangalan o makita ang aming mga mukha. We believe that the anti-terror law is not the way to combat terrorism, but a way to further incite people to resort to violence. So we joined everyone here who filed the petition before the Supreme Court questioning the constitutionality of the anti-terrorism law. In closing, let me say that I share the wish of those before me, our ancestors before us, where the achievement of peace is no longer in anyone's agenda, and that discrimination and equality are nothing but a thing of the past. So sad to say this. Maraming salamat at sana'y manatili tayong malakas sa puso, isip at diwa para mapanatiling nakatayo at lumalaban sa karapatang pantao ng bawat Pilipino. Maraming salamat po. Thank you, Sandra. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Thank you so much, Representative Sankopan, for your words and for describing and very vibrantly how the Moro and Muslim individuals and groups and communities are particularly suffering discrimination and stigmatization, but also to highlight again something that was said, I think, by other speakers, including Attorney Gilbert, that of course we have this ATA, but some bills that are extremely necessary are just not passed and are still waiting to be passed, including the Religious and Racial Discrimination Act, but also protection of human rights defenders. So I think this is a really important feature of the situation currently. I think we have in the chat some more details shared by Attorney Gilbert on the ATA, on the sections that he mentioned with his intervention that are particularly of interest for us today. And also a message of solidarity with the Moro people in the Philippines and other people who are suffering particular discrimination and stigmatization. So with that, I would like just to open the question and answer section, although as I said, you're also welcome to write in the chat as well if you have comments or questions. But because we are a closed circle and round here with not that many participants, it was really meant to be an open discussion. So I'm happy to also tell you that you can open your mic and camera, obviously, if you wish to speak and ask your question or make your comment directly to this round and to the panel. And I would like to ask kindly to introduce yourself if you decide to take the floor. So I'm leaving some minutes, so that people can think of maybe their reflection and comments or questions. Was a lot of information and also quite some things to digest in terms of the facts on the situation of high violence that the Philippines is still experiencing. So I'm leaving you to this short reflection and again, looking forward to your comments and questions. To do so, don't hesitate to raise your virtual hand on your profile, or just turn on your camera and express your wish to speak. I don't see any request for the floor or any question currently or comments in the chat. So I'm turning also to our colleagues on the panel to see if one of you have any reaction to what others said on the panel. I see, Elisa, you turn on your camera. I don't know if you want to, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists for the wonderful interventions that painted a clear picture of our situation in the Philippines. But at this point, I would like to take the opportunity to also to greet the families of victims of extrajudicial killings who are watching us. The international solidarity, knowing that there are those who really care about their situation and are with them in terms of seeking justice and accountability. That's a big thing for them. I'd like to greet them and as well as congratulate them, commend them for their courage in terms of standing up for their rights. And they are themselves also human rights defenders at this point. And I'd like to say, having had mentioned international solidarity, it was international solidarity that was it was a major force that that actually broke the Marcos dictatorship. And I think this time around can also break the resurgence of authoritarian rule in the Philippines. And we're now popularizing, as opposed to just a group of people within the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates doing the truth-telling and campaigning work. We're popularizing and involving our members and our partner families of victims of extrajudicial killings to partake also in the international solidarity and campaign work, truth-telling work of PAHRA. So one thing is for sure, this administration, this president will not divest in violence, and we should all stand up. It has become a collective moral obligation, also given that this is not happening only in the Philippines, but the resurgence of authoritarian rule is happening elsewhere as well. And we must send the message to other Duterte likenesses that something like this, massive human rights violations towards a political end, a selfish end, is not permissible in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and in particular for greeting and commending the courage of the families of the victims. Thank you so much for that, Elisa. I have the representative of the German embassy. Bitte schön, Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I have a question concerning news that has reached us today that there will be the DOH wants to have an investigation in cases of human rights violations by the police. And I would be interested if the speakers have already an evaluation on that, if that's a positive step in the direction of having accountability for human rights violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very important question. I am just looking to see if there is another hand. At this stage, I don't see any. So I don't know who would like to answer. Maybe I take the same order. Budit, maybe you want to intervene on that question, or Father Christian? You're muted, yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Alexander, a friend, a good friend from the German embassy. Essentially, we have not, as an alliance, yet discussed this new development. But essentially, as you may know, this administration has had many nominal actions, no? In terms of yielding positive results in such nominal steps, we have yet to see whether that happens. No, there have been nominal steps taken by the Department of Justice, the Philippine National Police, and for us, the greater accountability action is yet to be taken by this administration. Impunity is still, for us, clearly institutionalized. And of course, this is an executive agency. Thus, the chief executive has the full power to actually shoot down any initiative by the executive agencies that he is overseeing and has authority over. So hopefully, this action will not be used to whitewash or window dress the situation in the Philippines. Hopefully, I'd like to presume that certain officials in this administration And we believe that there are officials in this administration that are still have a good heart, no, have their hearts in the right place. But a lot of it's a pattern, no, in the Duterte administration that those who contradict the will of the president actually get sampled or become cautionary tales. They get sacked, and some have actually fallen victims to extrajudicial killings, mayors, judges, and prosecutors. So it's still a question mark for us. And I'd like to also clarify what I said in terms of the legislature being co-opted. We do have a handful of courageous legislators that are opposing and resisting the resurgence of authoritarian rule and the massive human rights violations, such as Representative Sangkopan here in the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. I will just give the floor in the order of the panel, so just you may all have a possibility to comment on this, or especially on how cautious we need to be when there are announcements of measures taken at the national level, as Elisa just said. Father Christian, please.
Thank you, Alexander, for that query. Well, the government keeps on making statements. So this is not, after all, new to us. In fact, when we lobby in Geneva, the government has its own figure. The victims on the war on drugs would be around 6,000, more than 6,000. The rest, thousands, the remaining deaths are DUI, deaths under investigation. And they said they're very serious with investigating these cases. And so all of a sudden we have statement from the DOJ. So that remains to be seen if they are really serious with with their investigation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Christian, for that. Attorney Gilbert, I don't know if you would like to say anything on that issue.
Yes, maybe from a symbolic standpoint, that's something welcome. But of course, we should go beyond symbolism. So we should go beyond that and into substance. Especially if you will notice that in this COVID-19 pandemic, the measures that were actually adopted by this administration are really more of police measures rather than health measures. So in fact, it's also a call on the Duterte administration not to adopt police measures, but to really adopt honest to goodness health measures that will address the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, very important point. Thank you so much. Representative Sangkopan, I don't know if you also wish to come on that point or anything that you would like to say at this stage.
Being one from the government, I think my fellow members of the panel have said already, and I share the same, because we have different views actually between the executive and the legislative. And on the part of the legislative in this time of pandemic, we're looking more at how we could possibly be of help to the executive arm. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you very much. I see we have two new messages. So a note of thanks from the embassy of Germany for the responses, and also could you elaborate a bit more on the joint program? What could be the opportunities and risks for CSO participating in this UN joint program from Misero, former colleagues from Misero. Elisa, you want to go? Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you so much for the wonderful and very relevant question. Basically, as I said in my presentation, it's a big contradiction. No? Unfortunately, civil society groups were not able to have any presence since the pandemic. And this administration has been very nimble and very agile in terms of defending its position and concealing the truth in the Philippines, and the efforts there led to the establishment of the Joint Human Rights Program. As I mentioned, it does not equal the gravity of what is happening in the Philippines. The Joint Human Rights Program that does not meet head-on the massive human rights violations, and it does not address the root cause, which is the explicit orders of the president, the political will that put into motion this massive human rights crisis in 2016. Now, we are involved. PAHRA is, together with other civil society groups, are involved in its implementation. It's a good framework had the situation in the country not been extraordinary. Had this been pre-Duterte, this Joint Human Rights Program, which is focused on long-term behavioral for security forces, behavioral change, and long-term institutional reforms would have been good, especially with the UN directly involved. Now, it's a big contradiction also, not because of the disparity between this solution and the massive human rights violations. It is also a big contradiction because in the Joint Human Rights Program, human rights groups are expected to work with government agencies and the UN. But how can we do so if we, outside this program, are assaulted, are red tagged, are killed? So that is the big problem, but we do not want to be put at a default, and that is why we are still involved in it, but in terms of, we refer to it as critical collaboration or critical partnerships. But we continue to pursue what is more important, which is that original intention of the L20 resolution is for the Council member states to actually establish, put into motion an international independent investigation through a commission of inquiry or fact-finding mission.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for that. I'm just looking if there is another hand or comment in the chat. I don't see any. No, I don't see any. So I would just like to offer the last minutes before I close the event to the rest of the panel, just if you have anything to add to what Elisa just said on this issue of how you as civil society and also from potentially from you, Representative Sangopan, from your position as a member of parliament representative, you see the opportunities and challenges and risks of the UNJP. Father Christian, I don't know if you would like to say something before we close.
Just very quickly with what Elisa had said, we are very part of it, but we are very cautious. Of course, the intention is good, but let us see how genuine is the conduct of the joint program. I remember when we talked to some friends in Geneva, and because we were telling them that this is an example of crime against humanity, and they were saying, I think Budi said, well, so far the mass killing or the genocide was only declared for Rwanda, Cambodia, and Yugoslavia at the time. So with 30,000 deaths. So I jokingly told him, how many more dead bodies does do the UN HRC want? What I'm trying to say is, we appeal to the international community, our domestic, our diplomatic friends here, to please, pressure our government, help us in coming up with the fact-finding commission or committee of inquiry to investigate the killings in the Philippines, war against drug, war against terror. And this is also really for justice, for the sake of the widows and the orphans. They number thousands, they are thousands and thousands of orphans. And so I speak in behalf of the voiceless and the victims and the survivors of human rights violations in the Philippines. That's for now.
And we thank you very, very much, Father Christian, for being that voice here. Before I close the meeting, again, I would like to see with Attorney Gilbert, if you want to say, add anything on this, the joint program or something else.
I think with respect to the joint program, it's something to look forward to, since presumably it creates capacity, it strengthens capacity. But this should also be balanced by the actual work of the government and the justice system, the DOJ, the CHR, the prosecutorial system, the courts, that they should really act in accordance with their international obligation to be duty bearers, to protect human rights. And one of that is to really prosecute those who are responsible for crimes against humanity, for murders, for extrajudicial killings, for torture. And if there's really political will on the part of this administration and the Philippine government, then nothing is really impossible. But if there's no political will, then everything will just be mere symbolism and window dressing. And we don't want that. And the CSOs are here to actually remind the Philippine government to really protect and enforce human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these words. Before I give the last word to Representative Sankopan, I would like to just read the question in the chat. Will there be a summary documentation of this meeting? Maybe there is even the video, the recording that will be available, correct? I'm asking, but I think it will be, yes. I have a thumb up from Christian at PAHRA, so it means there will be, and probably other documentation from this meeting will be made available to participants. But thank you very much for the question. And with that, I give the last word to, yes, sorry, I have Budit who would like to come again quickly on that. Please go ahead.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, basically, I just would like to mention one important point, because I mentioned the state of war and the state of belligerency that this administration, Duterte, stands for. And of course, in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, the social economic justice, there's no good program in place as well. And he will be at odds, this administration will be at odds with many nobly driven groups and individuals, and thus human rights violations will persist. But also very concerning is the peace process, the peace in Mindanao. But also I see here representatives of the Norwegian missions, the Norwegian embassy, and Norway, having invested heavily, helped the Philippines try to reach a peace agreement with the CPP, NDF, NPA. And any chances, because it's virtually an all-out war now at the stance of the Duterte position of the Duterte regime. Any chance of returning to the peace negotiation table is nearly virtually not. So that is also very concerning, and also the precarious and fragile situation of peace in Mindanao. And I must say, as also very important, we're talking about the Anti-Terror Act of 2020, but there are many executive issuances in existence as well that they put in place, a compendium of laws that are meant to restrict the movements of human rights defenders. And there will be more to come if nothing is done. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting, Representative Sangkopan. Sorry po.
But thank you so much for this additional point. And with that, immediately to you, Representative Sangkopan.
Yeah, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers of this activity for providing a platform for us Muslims and Maroons to also air our side of the story, our narrative be relayed to everyone, especially to the young Moros, the young Muslims. Our intention is just to bring forth that we still have actions to do from our end. There might have been a negotiation already. We already have a new political entity. We now have BARM based on the negotiation between the government and the Moro Front. A lot of things still has to be done for peace to really work within our region. And for us to get out of the bondage of this racial discrimination we experience in the entire country. And on that note, as a legislator, I see there's a lot that needs to be done aside from lobbying for the passage of the anti-racial discrimination law. We also have the Human Defenders Act bill that needs to be lobbied to and probably support from our end. And we also have to look at the National Transitional Justice bill, which is pending in the House, that this representation, together with the author of the Human Defenders Act bill, have filed. So we sought also support from the international community because we needed that these things be put forward to our government. So thank you so much to PAHRA, thank you Sandra, and to everyone here.
Thank you very, very much, Representative Sangkopan, for these last words. I mean, it's really, really important, as we said several times in this event, not only to have people very committed still, despite the danger in civil society, but also in the House of Representatives and in the Congress, more generally speaking, to pass the right laws, as we discussed. So with that, we arrive at the end of this event. I'm personally really, really happy to have been with you, and I think the panel was excellent. I really also thank everyone for the questions and comments. And I really hope that this briefing, because it was really a briefing on the current situation with a lot of very concrete asks toward the individual international community and the diplomatic community, will be helpful for the work at this session of the Council and beyond this. And I would like to end by really thanking again all the panelists and the participants, and wishing especially the people in the Philippines a lot of courage, and all of my thoughts and the thoughts of FI and other organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Just one last reminder for the remaining participants. Sorry, I forgot about this, but we have another side event coming. We'll send out the invitation and the Zoom link and the registration link tonight, or probably tomorrow morning. So there, October 7th, same time. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Gil.
Bye.
Ingat-ingat.
Budit.
Amping sa tanan, Budit.
Maraming salamat.
Ingat po.
Ingat.
God bless.
Yes,
Our sponsors, thank you, Attorney Gilbert.
So sorry, nawala ako sa ere, Budit.
Opo.
I'm so sorry.